Meet Liam Telfer. A firefighter and former NCO of the Household Cavalry, he's also a living historian who is passionate about sharing his knowledge about what it was like to march and fight during the Napoleonic Wars. In this video, we put some of your questions to him, covering myths from Sharp.
The idea of spit loading is total crap.
What it was like to fight with a musket.
In skirmish lines and stuff like that, it would have been more difficult.
And which is better, a Redcoat or the Channel's merch?
Oh, that's a tough one. That is a tough one.
That's all coming up right here on the Napoleonic Wars channel.
Hello, my name's Liam Telfer, assistant producer here at the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and you can see I am bedecked in the impression of a British infantryman from the Napoleonic Wars. The regiment I am portraying is the 44th East Essex. And today we're going to be answering your questions about all things musketry, so thanks very much for sending those in. The idea of spit loading is total crap, like you say, and it's just dangerous. It's really, really dangerous. Now we're working with the volatile material, that is gunpowder. Now it takes the smallest spark to ignite gunpowder, and when you're already firing from a barrel that's warm, to then put your face, or any body part for that matter, over that barrel, you are potentially going to have your lips stuck to it. You're potentially going to blow your own head off. So yeah, spit loading, although it looks great on TV with our favourite riflemen, hammering some troops to bring their times down, it's just not a thing. It's just unsafe, and it didn't exist.
Absolutely no spark. Damn!
It's a great question. Thanks for that one, Graham. In terms of the length of time it takes to change a flint, it can be quite quick. Once you get used to it, I think that would come down to the soldier's individual ability and training. There's definitely probably something to be said about trying to change a flint when you're under fire. But I think a point to consider is that the numbers we're talking, for instance, within an infantry battalion at the time, you're going to be able to sort of not hide, but you're going to be able to take care of your own business without necessarily endangering those around you. In much smaller groups, in skirmish lines and stuff like that, it would have been more difficult because your skirmish partner is relying on you. Now, in terms of what would make the musket fail, there's a sort of, not a plethora, but there's quite a few things that would lead to misfire. Now, the most common one, and the sort of what the phrase that everyone's heard before, is the flash in the pan, which is where the flint hits the hammer. You get the spark, and it ignites the powder in the pan, but then doesn't transfer through the touch hole to ignite the charge and therefore fire the ball. Generally, that happens because some of the wadding has blocked the touch hole and can be quite easily rectified using a pick to then puncture that hole through the touch hole. Another common form of misfire is that it just doesn't spark at all, and that's generally down to either the length or the quality of flint. The hammer can come into play here if it's not been hardened properly, or it's been too long between hardenings. Yeah, so that's when you don't get any spark and therefore no ignition whatsoever. And those are probably the two most common ways in which firelocks like this fail on the battlefield. Yes, to a certain degree, damp powder is usable. On a day like today, there's a lot of water in the air. We've been rained on, and it will still work. You get that kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily damp, but that sort of moisture in the air. And you can notice those sorts of days when you can sort of feel it on your clothes. And it will still work. However, when you start getting it very wet, then your powder just turns into kind of a black sludge and is useless. You can dry it out and then reuse it. You can sort of dehydrate it and reuse it. However, I'd be very careful in how you do that. We're clearly not going to try and dry this out by the fire. And then moving on to the sort of battles in wet conditions, I think one of the most famous examples of this is Albufeira, the very wet conditions to be fighting in. And unfortunately, the firelock just isn't going to work. in that sort of torrential level of rain when it's really coming down. You know, part of the loading process is to open the pan and prime. Now, yes, there is only a small gap between the cock here and the hammer and the pan, as you can see. But if this gets filled up with water as I'm putting powder in, again, it's just going to turn to sludge. We're not really going to get a clean spark from the flint, and it's not going to ignite the charge. And therefore, this basically becomes almost a spear with the bayonet or a club. So those sorts of battles or engagements or skirmishes where firelocks are too wet to use are going to be very bloody and very close in terms of their hand-to-hand fighting. Again, that's a great question. And actually, conversely to the whole spit and the ball thing, there are accounts, and certainly an account from the Revolutionary War, where British soldiers were tap loading, i.e. they weren't withdrawing the ramrods and they're just using gravity to force that ball down the barrel. So it's certainly a thing that happened during the wider period that we know. The way it would affect the round depends probably mostly on the fouling. Now, if you've got a very clean barrel, tap loading it will take the ball all the way into the chamber and therefore sit snugly on the powder. If you've got a pretty fouled barrel, the potential is that it extends the distance between the charge and the ball, and therefore you lose some muzzle velocity, therefore affecting range and sort of affecting that impact of fire on the enemy. So tap loading was a thing that worked, but by ramming the ball home, we make sure that we've got the maximum velocity for the ball leaving the end of the barrel. Again, it depends on the soldier. Now, they would have trained a lot with fixed bayonets, both in hand drill and also in arms drill. And they would have been very much used to presenting arms and firing with the bayonet fitted. So in terms of actually aiming the musket, it doesn't really take a lot away from that. What it does do is add 17 inches of steel in weight to the end. So when you do present, there is a tendency to let the muzzle drop more purely because of the weight. But with training and the sort of right applied strength, this can be overcome. British soldiers of the period were taught to aim. They were trained to fire at aiming marks in recruit training. We see plenty of references, certainly for the light infantry regiments that were training in Shorncliffe. So these men were trained to fire at marks, whether they be quite small or whether sort of almost a width target that would be used to simulate the front end of a French column, probably not in reality as wide as that. So yes, British soldiers were taught to aim. Moving on to the sort of the lethality, there's a couple of factors at play here. One is similar to the previous question. How has the musket been loaded and how dirty is it? If we've got a nice clean barrel and we're able to ram that ball nicely down and home, I think you could probably be lethal at 100 yards, maybe even more. Because I think the muzzle velocity will take this ball 200 yards. The trouble you've got with that isn't necessarily the muzzle velocity, but it's what we talked about before, the windage. Now, when the ball sits in the barrel and the charge is ignited, some of the gases will escape round the side of that ball. And then as the ball then travels down a smoothbore barrel, it will bounce down the barrel almost. I mean, this is an accentuated movement, but it will ping down. And therefore, when it leaves the muzzle, it might go off in a different direction every time, depending on the quality of powder, how much powder's been in the charge. So the problem isn't necessarily the lethality of the ball, but getting the ball on target in order for it to be lethal is probably the hardest part. In the period, soldiers were trained to shoot right-handed, regardless whether you were left-handed or not. So for our left-handed watchers and viewers and listeners, you would have been trained purely right-handed, and you would have had to be able to master that before moving through your training. There's no option to fire it left-handed, as you can see. Firing it right-handed the lock is on the right-hand side, and you get that ignition from the charge. Now, if I'm firing it left-handed, and then interestingly, when I first started shooting as a kid, I used to shoot left-handed. Now, this would not be a pretty comfortable place to be when you get that charge igniting in the pan with all of the powder sparks coming up. So no, shooting left-handed with this type of firelock isn't really an option. No, this isn't a South Essex uniform. However, you probably do recognise the red coat and yellow facings from the Sharp series. Bernard Cornwell has acknowledged that he very loosely based the South Essex around the 44th East Essex, and I think you do see those parallels together with the yellow facings. Now, this comes back to depending on which drill manual you read, and there are many that cover line and light infantry. The British Army didn't always fight in two ranks. We should say that first of all, and we think, as more research is done into this, that actually local commanders, battalion commanders, company captains, and things like that had a lot more tactical flexibility in their sort of their where they lay their troops. Okay, so if you're trying to fill a gap, for example, but two ranks is too long, then go to three or perhaps go to four. There's great examples of soldiers fighting in four ranks at Quatre Bras, for example. In terms of how they arranged their troops, now the continental style is that we know is the tallest guys were in the front rank, and then a drop off in height as we go back through the ranks. A bit of a Victorianism / later army is for everyone lines up with the tallest man on the right hand side for the British Army, and as they fall in, they're assigned a spot by an NCO or a senior NCO. And then what happens is you go tallest on the right, shortest on the left, and you end up with a bowing effect. But I think most historians would say that this is a much later invention. In terms of the way the British do it in the period per the manual, it's not particularly clear. But also, when you look at it from a tactical standpoint in terms of the battlefield, I think that would be two very different areas. And I think it's something that deserves a bit more research in order to answer clearly. So as you can see from the sling here, it is tight. From what we know, it's pretty clear that they were done tight up. They weren't necessarily designed to be carried by the sling loose over the shoulder. Because of the nature of drill at the time, it would be seen as quite slovenly to have your sling loose and hanging down. Now, what we see when soldiers are just marching and covering large distances, generally when they left a cantonment, a camp, or a town, for the first mile, they would march in very tight formations, in step, in the correct drill manner. After that first mile, they could do what was called marching at ease, where they stay in the same formation, but you could remove your stock. You could carry your firelock as was comfortable, whether you're more comfortable at the trail or you see, over the shoulder like this, depending on the distance that you're going to cover. So yeah, by the time they then get to within a mile of their destination, and that could be, contact with the enemy, then we'd want to be tightening this sling up so it's not getting in the way to carry out the fire and revolution drills.
Present! Keep it wet. Keep it wet. Fire! Cover!
That's a great question. Now, in terms of the training that we did with Zach, it was much shorter. So I'll probably give him the benefit of the doubt and say that Josh was brilliant to train and was super responsive. And for me, the jury will still be out on Zach. We need to do a little bit more to answer that properly. That's a tough one. That is a tough one. And you've got my, you're hitting me in the divided loyalties right there. From a practical point of view, I would say the red coat is comfortable, it's warm, and it's befits the weapon system and the equipment I'm carrying. However, as we've seen, as we will see, I'm sure that Josh does a great job of doing a similar activity in a hoodie. So they both have their merits, and I'm going to steer firmly on the fence, actually. Just to wrap this up, thank you very much for your questions. We really appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our various platforms. You know, we're on YouTube and Spotify. And if you want some more information and some more content, then please check out our Patreon. Thanks for watching.
If you've got more questions for Liam, comment below. Don't forget that you can enjoy more Napoleonic history on our show, the Napoleonic Wars podcast. And remember to like and subscribe so that you can enjoy more videos like this on the Napoleonic Wars channel.